The first and the most important rule is that you have to give intention-revealing names. You give a certain name once, or maybe twice if it was renamed, but you'll read the given name most likely hundreds of times. This means that you have to give names which reflect the intention of a member. If you declare a variable named Z, which really implies a zip code instead of a zip code, then how you are going to understand what you meant giving that name a month ago? You have to read all the code which is relevant to that variable and logically deduce its real meaning. Sometimes it is simple to find a good name and you can give it within a couple of seconds, but sometimes the process of finding an appropriate name can last much longer. Anyway, the first rule is to use intention-revealing names. The name C reveals nothing. The name customer reveals the meaning of a variable. A variable declared like this, int age, is also not a good choice. Take a look at this variable. Why do you think this is a bad name? You can pause the video and think a little bit. Right. Just looking at this declaration, we can't say what unit of measurement is implied by this variable. The age in years or days? So it would be better to name that variable as age in years or age in days. Some names may look like very informative. For example, in Perl, the length function called with a string passed in as a parameter returns the number of characters in that string. Logically. In the same Perl, the length function called with an array passed in as a parameter returns what? Do you think the number of elements? Nope, it returns the number of array dimensions. So that function returns 1 from the one-dimension array, no matter how many elements are stored in it. This is what I call disinformation. A function should do what is expected from its name. Different meanings should not be expressed by the same or similar name. This is a common case when developers come out with similar names for different domain concepts. After that, all the way along, all developers will misuse similarly named members. You're writing code for humans, not for a compiler. Put that in your pipe and smoke it. For the sake of a better readability, follow English grammar rules. For example, the name horizontal alignment is better than the alignment horizontal, and can scroll vertically is better than scrollable Y. Of course, you should apply this rule wisely, so don't start to include everywhere a and the articles. Don't give a name to a variable such as the counter. Instead, just name it counter. Don't give such names like GWVWE or GWRSP, even if this is meaningful from the domain perspective. Express the domain concept in a pronounceable way. If your native language is not English, then don't try to program using your native language. I can name a variable as количество in Russian, what means in English count. Use English as a language for naming all the members. Please, forget about the Hungarian notation. We live in the 21st century. Our IDEs are very powerful. You just don't need to add those junky prefixes to your member names. If a variable is of type int, then don't add I before the name. For example, I_count. Just leave it as count. When you hover the mouse pointer over the variable name, it will show you its type. Don't add prefix a for local variables, for example for function parameters. All the prefixes should stay in the past. The exception from this rule in .NET is the I prefix for interfaces. This is an established agreement. Don't go against it. The code is not a place for jokes. In a project I've participated in, developers started to use an obsolete string property for jokes. They set it to send to the administration of the president. string value. Ha! Ha ha! Very funny. A colleague of mine said he knew a developer who named temporal variables like, I'm sorry, but I'll say what I've heard. He named variables like suck, fuck, dick. After that, eventually he came up with a good name and performed a rename refactoring. He forgot to refactor that names a couple of times, so other developers were astonished when faced that names. Remember, the code base might be read by many developers, even by developers with whom you are not familiar yet. And don't use cute names. Don't name a method whack instead of kill. Feel free to add valuable information from the technical perspective. For example, you're allowed to name a class as Customer Builder or Customer Factory. This is very helpful for understanding the design of dependent classes. For any normal developer, it is obvious that those suffixes mean the pattern which was implemented by those classes. It's a very good practice to use names which come from a problem domain. When you use problem domain names, then you can easily communicate with customers. This is especially helpful when implementing domain-driven design, or DDD in short. For example, if people who work in the problem domain say shift instead of session, what implies a working period, then you should name a class shift, not session, even if you like the latter. People love symmetry. Symmetry is easily understandable. A good example of symmetry can be found in Kent Beck's book Implementation Patterns. Here is an example of a method which lacks symmetry. The second statement is more concrete than the other two function calls. It's better to rewrite this on the basis of symmetry. The result may look like this. Still, this method violates symmetry. The input and output operations are named after intentions, while increment count is named after an implementation. Looking for symmetries, I think about why I am incrementing the count, perhaps resulting in the following code. I should admit that this is a very subtle example. Here are some straightforward examples of symmetric names, which are super understandable as well. Begin, end, first, last, locked, unlocked, min, max, next, previous, old, new, open, closed, visible, invisible, source, target, source, destination, up, down. Let's talk about the scope and name length. The general rule here is, the wider the scope, the lengthier the name. The narrower the scope, the shorter the name. If a variable exists within 3 lines of code, then it's not so important to give it a long descriptive name. Take a look at the following function. Do you see that e variable which is used in the for each loop? We can name it employer, but it's perfectly clear what e means. The scope is very short. At the same time, you shouldn't give very short names for variables declared as fields. If you read a function which uses a field named d, then you have either to jump up to the declaration or to hover the mouse pointer over the variable in order to find out at least its type. Oh, its type is document. So couldn't it have been better to name it as document or just doc? A class name should be a noun, for example, customer, painter, datetime parser, and so on. Try to avoid too broad names like manager, data, info. Try to avoid adding these garbage words, data or info. How the hell customer is different to customer data? Why were they separated? Functions names should be verbs. Get customers, generate dump are good names for functions. Functions which return Boolean values should be named as predicates. Can remove student is a good name for a function which returns a Boolean value. By the way, Boolean parameters are also should be named as predicates. For example, is correct, is busy, can extract, and so on. Code should be readable as a well-written prose. Consider the following examples. The first two examples are much more readable. List contains item is better than list is contained item. The first one sounds more natural. So the general advice is you shouldn't forget about English grammar. Strive to make your code readable as a well-written prose. Okay, that's it, fine. Let's talk about naming conventions in the .NET platform. Once in a company I've been working for, one of the developers got retired and I had to pick up one of his projects. I opened his solution written in Delphi. Then I opened one of the UI forms and what I've seen frustrated me very much. All the buttons were named button 1, button 2, button 3, button 4. All the UI elements were named by names generated by default. He literally named all the things in his codebase like that. All the event handlers were named button 1 underscore click, button 2 underscore click, and so on. It's much better to give descriptive names to all members in your code. Consider the following great names for buttons. Generate report for a button which triggers the generation of a report. Close workshift for a button which triggers the closing process of a workshift. Close window for a button which triggers the closing of a window. Notice that buttons are usually named by using verbs, since they usually intended to trigger some kind of action. Class 1. Is it a good name for a class? What would the reader of such a class do? He would have to read all the content before figuring out the actual meaning of this class. Customer sounds much better as a name for a class, if it contains data and functionality concerning customers. Do not use mysterious names. Meaningless names. Have you ever seen methods named like this? Start processing, retrieve data. Almost always such names are meaningless. Yes, they are not named like function 1 or function 2, but nevertheless, you cannot say what they are intended for exactly. The first one starts some kind of process, the second one retrieves some kind of data, but this does not help much. Again, the reader would have to read all the content before figuring out the meaning of these methods. Much better names are parse XML file rather than start processing, or retrieve student info, though this is still not the best one, but this is much better than the previous version. Shortened names. In the early days of programming, there was a lack of tool support, and people struggle with navigation and understanding their code. Very often developers shortened variable names. Consider the following example. These names are from the project I have been working with. The first field meant initialization message. In this case, we can make it init message, since init is a widely known term. docv meant document group for some reason. Hell, I even don't understand why he used v suffix here. addr2 meant addressee. Try to avoid shortening variable names. In the modern world, this looks ridiculous. Names with encodings, aka Hungarian notation. Many old developers can't become accustomed to the fact that modern IDEs for managed languages are so powerful that we just don't need any encodings like Hungarian notation. My boss, a developer with more than 15 years of experience, applied some kind of notation which I actually do not understand until now. He named all the function parameters with a prefix, like in the following example. A set, a row. He argued that when he uses parameters in the method's body, he always knows that variables with the a prefix are function parameters. My colleagues and me, we have never faced the problem of distinguishing local parameters from class fields. IDE will always say that there is some kind of ambiguity in the worst case. Avoid any notations like in the following examples. Much better names are name length, session numbers. Ambiguous names. Sometimes you may encounter ambiguous names. Look at these declarations. Document name ID field, money to string method. Document name ID. Is it a name or ID? Is it an ID of a name? If so, then why it is of type string? The second one just blows my mind. This is a real example from one of the projects I've been working in. How the hell the function can be named money to string when it returns an integer? Avoid ambiguous names. Names should clearly reveal their only one well-expressed intent. Noisy names. Sometimes developers think that applying English grammar is a good idea and they are right, but you shouldn't do that blindly. Consider the following examples. The first method should be named just enroll student without article there. Suffix list is needless in the declaration of list of students. It's much better to just declare students. Don't add needless noise to the member names. Naming predicates. As we said previously in the course, it's a good practice to give predicate names for Boolean variables. Most of the time, developers start their names with is or can predicates. Sometimes it's better to omit them. Consider the following example. Read it. If is found. We can make it better by renaming like this. Read it. If found. Well, that's better. In this case, we follow the rule that the code should be readable as a well-written prose.